Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Green Flame, the Deep Green Resistance broadcast that brings you radical analysis, practical skills, and artistic expression from the revolutionary movement to defend the planet and rebuild just human communities. I am your host and comrade, Max Wilbert.
And I am your co-host, Jennifer Mernan. For this episode, we are honored to be talking with Renee Gerlich. The Green Flame's relationship with Renee began in December of 2019 when she contributed to our podcast on radical feminism. In October of 2021, Renee shared an outline of her brief complete herstory series. And now we join Renee in celebrating the publication of Out of the Fog in 2022 by Spinifex Press. Renee, it is a pleasure to invite you on to the Green Flame for the third time. This is a first for us. This, of course, is to celebrate the publication of Out of the Fog on politics, feminism, and coming alive. Congratulations on your publication with Spinifex last year.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I feel very honored to be granted a third interview with you as well, and looking forward to it.
Oh, the pleasure is all ours. These are always such fascinating conversations, and I have enjoyed your book so much. Before we began, I wanted to see if I could introduce you to our audience just by reading the bio that you have at the beginning of the book. So I'll start with that. Renee Gerlich is a New Zealand-based writer whose work can be found on Feminist Current, Savage Minds, Uncommon Ground Media, and her blog, reneejg.net. Renee has a background in art history and education and completed her master's in art history at Leiden University in the Netherlands. She was researcher for the 2016 documentary The Heart of the Matter, about the development and subsequent rollback of education reforms implemented by New Zealand's first Labour government, directed and produced by Lut and Jan Beringa. In 2021, Renee founded Dragon Cloud Press to publish The Brief Complete Herstory, an accessible, female-centered, short and illustrated history of the world, from the Big Bang to neoliberalism, available at dragoncloudpress.com. Thank you, Renee, for letting me introduce you straight from the book. Thank you. There is so much ground to cover here. And last night, in preparation for this interview, I listened to your first interview about Out of the Fog with Thistle Pedersen on WLRN. And that was a fabulous, long, extended interview that covered so much of the political aspects and so much of the feminist aspects of this book. So I'd like to embark into some other material in our conversation and highly suggest to all of our listeners that they listen to that interview as well. I'd love to begin by asking you to kind of describe the book to us, and to break it down chapter by chapter as far as what you've covered in your writing.
Yes, sure. Well, I guess the motivation for the book, well, it was really twofold. It was very cathartic for me to write this one, just like my Brief Complete Herstory series. It felt like it was all the answers that I'd found after a lifetime of confusion and asking questions about why is the world this way, what's going on, why are people acting so crazy, as they seem to be doing in this day and age. And as always, when I get confused, I read until I feel satisfied. And then reading makes me kind of need to write to piece things together. And this book is the result of all of that. In shaping it into a book about, a specific topic, it really has become about the liberal left and about the confusion that the liberal left doesn't just express, but that really characterizes the liberal left. So in the beginning of the book, the introduction really illustrates the scope of the book. It talks about specific examples of different movements that the liberal left is taking positions on these days, from climate change to Black Lives Matter to gun violence, Me Too, and so forth. And then it talks about how the liberal left sort of progressive positions on each of these issues, they don't marry up they don't reconcile very neatly. And I use examples of things like prisons and state institutions in general that on one issue, for instance, Black Lives Matter was founded by prison abolitionists, whereas the Me Too movement asks for rapists to be persecuted and given sentences that do justice to the severity of the violation. And then, of course, another great example is how the liberal left absolutely hates science deniers when it comes to climate change. But then when they begin to speak about transgenderism, science itself becomes something that they consider to be colonial, a kind of Western construct that we should question in the name of identity. So there's all this inconsistency. And yeah, I've really wanted to sort through that and kind of diagnose what it's rooted in, which is also why my book is a feminist text, because I suggest that the roots are in really ignoring women, who are half the human population, and who live with the most common, probably, form of violence among the human species, which is rape. In being a male-dominated movement, liberal left is uncomfortable with not only discussing the issue of rape, but treating it with the seriousness of a public issue. So even in the Me Too movement, it's still treated as testimony that isn't really allowed to accumulate into an analysis of the world and what patriarchy is, and, a feminist movement based on a material analysis. In accepting and having contradictory positions on rape, that is the thing that I argue makes the liberal left fundamentally flip-floppy and inconsistent. But I at some point took my manuscript, or kind of set a bunch of drafts and notes to a woman who calls herself a book coach. And she looked at them and she said, you need to put yourself into this. You can't just write a detached political text. So that's why the first chapter is actually something like a memoir, because I came to accept that she was right, that I needed to have my own voice in the text a lot more than I originally planned to. So that first chapter, which is just called My Story, also makes these political ideas come alive, because they talk about my various experiences of politicizing initially, and then coming into the liberal left, and then becoming a feminist and kind of being pushed back out of the liberal left, and then starting to ask all these deep questions which led the book to be written. And then the chapter after that is called Desire and Distortion. And it's called that because the main thing that led me to be kind of exiled from the liberal left is beginning to speak, well, first of all about prostitution, but then about transgenderism as an ideology, which is absolutely taboo, as you know, in leftist politics, to question that idea, or even to label it an ideology. But that whole experience, and just observing that within politics today, has led me to ask really profound questions, because I think that the topic demands that there's no superficial explanation for why so much of the public these days is denying biology. There's no easy answer to why that can happen. You have to delve quite deep. And what it's taught me is that just what sexuality really is, and how it is that human beings come to be conditioned to accept social norms in the first place, and that it's not just a kind of passive programming that we go through from childhood. Or I think the general anarchist understanding tends to be something to do with repetition, that we constantly see certain images and messages around us to the point that we're almost programmed with them. But I think that there's something much more visceral going on, where the deeper I look into the question of what sexuality is, the more I understand that sexuality is our connection to nature itself, that it is our place within the movement of life, that it therefore involves our longings, our visions for the world, so much to do with everything about who we are is wrapped up and condensed into our sexuality and our sexual experiences, and obviously including our trauma. So it makes sense then that the place where we're acting kind of the most crazy and absurd is in that area. The metaphor of Pandora's box. it's a sexual metaphor, really, and it's appropriate. When you look inside of that box, all the beauty, but also all the nonsense and all the stuff that people don't want to see will come out. Human sexuality is full of everything about who we are. And this chapter, it talks about this, about desire, and how as we're conditioned, we don't, Noam Chomsky wrote that book, The Manufacturing Consent, and I haven't actually read it. I probably should have. I haven't actually read it. But the title, I mean, my argument would be that consent is not manufactured, it's distorted. Desire is distorted, and the wants that we come to have in this society are not manufactured. They're distortions of the desire that's inborn within us, that is Eros, that is our sexuality. And so I write about how the way that this distortion occurs, and it occurs through us developing identifications that are insisted upon by society at large through its institutions, through its hierarchies, and that the primary identification is male identification in the patriarchy, that we learn that we must behave in ways that will have us accepted by men, and it's unconscious. But in feminism, we call this the male gaze. We end up internalizing this idea about how we should behave, how we should look, that will, satisfy this man with the male gaze. So then the chapter after that sort of argues that what's true in the human psyche is true in politics. I argue that, a lot of people understand politics to be about values, and differences in values are what characterize the different political traditions. But I'm saying it's not about values at all whatsoever. It's all about these identifications, these conditioned identifications. And the major political traditions are distinguished by the specific male identifications that they each have. And that chapter has a brief history of liberalism, the left, and then the emergence of the liberal left that illustrates what the particular male identification is in each tradition. And then I'll try to quicken my summary of the last two chapters. But the next chapter is one that kind of allows the reader to put my frameworks to the test. It's a survey of political events from 2014 to 2019, which demonstrates some of these identifications and so forth in action through current events. It also includes a critique of free speech and reformist approaches to social change. And then the last chapter is really an argument for anarchism. And it talks about what I mean by that and what I believe anarchism to be. And basically it's a way of breaking free of all these identifications and conditioned patterns by choosing, this is something I think that's becoming a common concept today, responsibility over reactivity, responding over reacting. And I just argue that anarchism is the collective vision of that, if we choose to respond rather than react collectively, that's what anarchism is. It's a refusal to outsource your own ability to respond to the world to politicians and authority figures, and a reclamation of that power. So, and I give various examples of how women have done this in a very visceral and literal sense to make it real. Yeah, so that chapter is all about that. Yes, and that's the text out of the fog.
That covers so much. Some of the things here that intrigue me the most are your personal counts. I think that it was the best advice ever that you put yourself into this book. And those are the places where I engage the most. So what I'd like to ask about are the moments or the times at which you had broken free, that the fog lifted. And specifically, what was it for you that caused the fog to lift? I mean, at one point you talk about going through an experience of Satori.
Oh,
Did I say that properly?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
And that the fog lifted for an entire year. And that is quite intriguing to me. What happened then?
Yeah, it's funny you ask that. it's something that I find slightly uncomfortable and embarrassing to mention in the book, because I feel like, saying I had this Satori experience, which is like a brief glimpse into awakening, in this day and age where spirituality is kind of fashionable. I feel like I'm making some kind of claim to some special spiritual status or something like that. But really, yeah, it was even right in the book about how I had a relationship with the man who has since passed. His name was Gerald. I was very, very, very fond of him, and he was French, and he said one thing he missed about living in New Zealand was he found it difficult to have like a good political conversation, the kind that you might have in France or Spain, where people are known for having these lively politicized discussions and where they're not afraid of offending each other. New Zealand is a very much kind of don't rock the boat sort of place. And I remember that him saying that because I felt kind of like I could relate, but embarrassed about my own political illiteracy because I hadn't really grown up with those conversations myself, and I felt really frustrated about how difficult it was for me to engage in something that's really a birthright to all of us, which is discussions about the state of the world, the state of the culture we live in, the state of our social environment. I felt mystified by all of it. But he mentioned several figures that he was very interested in, and I just must have been love, my original motivator. One of them was Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of Burma, Myanmar. At the time, she wasn't. She was under house arrest. She had written a text called Freedom from Fear. And there was something about reading that book that it's funny because I've read it again since, or I've returned to it, and it hasn't had the same effect on me. It's a powerful reading her writing, but I can't quite put my finger on why it had such a profound effect on me back then. But she introduced me to Thich Nhat Hanh's concept of socially engaged Buddhism, which I connected with just so deeply I can't even express it. Somehow, as I read her work, and one thing that struck me about her was that her commitment to her country, the commitment that she expressed in her text. And it kind of made me think about how I'd grown up in a town that I was always wanting to escape. And I write about that in the book as well. A lot of towns in New Zealand, small town New Zealand, is kind of, we're famous for kind of mentioning the town that we're from and sort of cringing and laughing about it because, and you're supposed to kind of want to grow up and want to get out of these places as you're growing up and move into more glamorous or more lively centers and cities. But when I read about her commitment to the place she came from, I kind of started questioning that, and I realized that, no place on earth is irrelevant or is just kind of a waiting room for somewhere else. And something about clicking onto that suddenly made me feel very present. I think it stopped that need to run away or that need to escape where I was.
We can complete a thought with, being in the place that you are, that suddenly not being afraid of being there, of being present is in itself a lifting of the fog. Wherever you are, to be present entirely in that moment, in that place, without reservation. And another thing that you talk about with your experience that's truly, truly profound is this. You said that it's your birthright. It's your birthright to be able to have these conversations, to be able to be aware of and have discourse about what's going on around you politically, and to have a grasp on the forces that are moving your world. So, those elements in your own story are obviously inspiration for writing the book and have led you to this place of lifting the fog. But I'm fascinated by the combination of political as well as a spiritual element. And the combination of those two. You don't talk about that a lot.
No.
It's kind of a taboo thing, and it's don't mix it up. Is that an accurate?
Not so much. I think that it's more that I was reading political feminist literature almost, well, not exclusively, but very intensively from like 2015 to about 2019. And it was during that time that I really did the groundwork for this text. But it was at the end of 2019 that I really started turning to spirituality and really started asking myself where the overlap was between politics and spirituality. And so my book is written, it's a political text primarily, but it was a lot of the spiritual texts for me, I suppose, came later. Right at the beginning and right at the end of the period of time that I was writing about. I have actually, I'm working on another manuscript that's much more spiritual in its focus. But yeah, I guess that was one of the things that made it important to me to talk about this Satori experience, as I call it, because I think that often in radical politics, maybe not, I mean certainly a lot, and in feminism too, spirituality and politics can be seen as being at odds, or spirituality and activism. And I think that's largely because these days the rhetoric around mindfulness and, yoga culture, it's all very liberalized. So we recognize that, when you tell someone, you're safe, let go of your thoughts. And if you're angry, just breathe, you know what I mean? We're surrounded by a lot of that. And I think you can see how it can be very potentially domesticating. But in fact, in my experience, it was about 8 months of experiencing this profound peace. And what it did for me is it made the nonsense around me very transparent. I was unafraid of authority figures. I didn't buy into these systems that we live with at all. I saw them as a kind of a game, not in a transgressive way, but just, I respected people, but I didn't respect these systems in and of themselves because they're made up. And I wasn't afraid of them at all. And so when it came to choosing between what I thought preserved my own peace and peace among people and institutional protocol, it was a no-brainer. I would take the path of peace. So I politicized out of this Satori experience where I was on university campus studying education and seeing the painful ironies and discrepancies between the educational rhetoric that we were expected to regurgitate in the exams versus the protocol that we were obviously also expected to carry into our practice. And they were completely at odds. Like they were just as ironic and contradictory as, the transgender stuff, which was all over the place. It was just, and I felt that if we were being trained in anything, it was hypocrisy and resignation, because all the lecturers would come in and say, look, I know that this is not really the best way to teach. Nevertheless, I'm in this institution and I can't do anything about it. I haven't got any power. So here we go. And I was like, no, I'm not going to learn to become that. And so I ended up sitting out an exam and submitting a submission co-written with several other students instead of completing one of my exams. And that was my entry into activism. So for me, that first encounter with socially engaged Buddhism was eventually what turned me into an activist when it came up against institutional nonsense. Yeah.
I love that story. I absolutely love that story. And that's not an expected outcome at all. At least not kind of the way that I've thought about Buddhism before, or I thought about spirituality before.
Yeah.
That you end up in a moment of such clarity that you cut through all of the fog and you become an activist and rebel. That's
yeah.
and
being present. So I didn't engage in if I protest, what will happen to my diploma? Oh, my whole future is at stake. I didn't get into that worry. It was just, I'm being asked to choose between what is true for me and the protocol. What am I going to choose? Well, I'm here now. I'm going to act according to what's true for me. I'm not going to engage on all this. I'll just take the consequences. And that's where that kind of state of being led me. It wasn't like, I think sometimes those Buddhist or Buddhist influenced narratives about mindfulness and peace are interpreted in a way that would say, if you're upset about within this institutional environment or as a student, you just need to calm down. But my experience of that state was that wasn't how it directed me. It inspired me it just made it easy for me to act according to what I felt was true in the moment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to pick up that theme when we rejoin again with another segment of this interview and talk about truth and the importance of truth. Yeah. Thank you. Let's sign off for a second and come back.
Sure.
In the interlude between the two halves of our interview with Renee Gerlich, I'll read 4 passages from Out of the Fog on politics, feminism, and coming alive. From Introduction, page 12. So, though some feminists resist using rape as an analogy for good reason, part of the insult of rape is precisely its abstract dimension, that it contradicts the greatest and deepest human impulse to love, that it is the quintessential act of desecration and an attempt at spiritual cannibalism. Rape selects the very origin of all humanity, the female sex, as its target, and subjects this target to an act that contradicts love like no other. If to love is to give and to be energized in the giving, to fuck something, excuse my language, is to take, to deplete in the taking, and yet to be gratified. The ultimate insult of rape is its revelation that it is possible for a human being to find gratification this way. From Introduction, page 13. Many self-help authors who analyze today's epidemics of depression, anxiety, and chronic stress tell us some version of the saber-toothed tiger story about these problems. They say that we are anxious because the stress response, evolved in caveman times to save us from grizzly bears and lions, lags behind the progress we have made building an industrial civilization in which most of us no longer encounter lions and tigers in everyday life. Our bodies are such that we still get stressed, as though our lives are wild, when in fact they are thoroughly civilized. So silly-belly humans sometimes react to a terse email as though it is a cobra poised to strike. We just need to retrain our backward nervous systems and encourage them to catch up with reality. This explanation is wanting. It frames industrial civilization as progressive, something human nature should catch up with, rather than resist. Says who? Meanwhile, war, rape, and pornography have created a situation in which the biggest threat to human beings today, and certainly women and girls, are the males of our own species. Masculine socialization makes this absurdly unnatural situation possible by numbing the sensitivity of boys and men and creating an epidemic of sexual assault. Our nervous systems appear to be out of whack because they are responding to an absurd situation in which human beings have become predators unto ourselves. The threat we face is among and within us, and our bodies are responding accordingly. From Chapter 2, Desire and Distortion, page 66. What sexuality truly requires of human beings is what humanity requires of us, and the way we approach sex is the way we shape humanity. Sex and humanization cannot be separated, and the fundamental question we need to ask is the way we treat life and sexuality making us more exquisitely alive, loving, and sensitive, or is it deadening, making us disassociated and numb? From Chapter 3, Rebellion and Backlash, page 105. Capitalism simply cannot contend with either women or sex. Both defy the imperative of rationalization and commodification, and both challenge the very notion of individual self-interest. Capitalism cannot account for, quote, Eros, sexual attraction, which has always been suspect in the eyes of the political elites as an uncontrollable force. This is a quote from Sylvia Ferradici, her book Witches, Witch Hunting, and Women, published in 2018. It cannot account for bodies that bleed in rhythm with the cycles of the moon, for voluntary intimacy that does not involve any transaction, for the creative act of intercourse in which two people come together and make three, the equation from which a whole world of human life is born, for the way that a human being grows in a woman's womb, for how a mother's body naturally prepares to nourish and feed her child with no invoice to follow, for belonging, free of possessive ownership. Through a capitalist lens, this is all inexplicable witchcraft, and though women constitute half the world's population, we are still an inconceivable anomaly, our contribution indeed impossible to account for on any balance sheet. So we left off with, I guess, a question that I have about truth. And one of the insights that I want to share that I got from your book after I had read it and listened to it is I came to the conclusion that the only thing more damaging than being severed from community is being severed from fundamental truths. That you can have these identities, and it's very compelling as a human animal to want to be part of a community or be part of a political movement and to buy into all of that we're kind of hardwired to be communal creatures. And it's really frightening to be thrown outside of a group. But what's more damaging than that is not being connected to fundamental truth and reality. That there's biological truth. For example, in the case of transgenderism, in order to belong to this left-wing movement or, transgender ideology, you have to divorce yourself from biological reality. You have to deny biological reality. And getting away from those truths is the most damaging thing that you can do. That holding that integrity, that internal integrity to what you know to be truth is much more important ultimately than that community identity. That's something that I don't know if that was intended in your book, but that's something that I truly got out of it. Personal integrity is everything, and connection to fundamental truth and to biological reality and processes is everything. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, I mean, that's all. There's a few themes wrapped up in there, and that's huge. And in some sense, I feel actually unqualified to be speaking about such big issues as a person who, I talk about having had this Satori experience that was a very long time ago now, and I feel like I'm grappling as much as anyone else with all these questions. But nevertheless, I've kind of concluded for myself that a big part of the problem that we have in this day and age is in the chapter of my book where I talk about social conditioning, and that begins in childhood. So I have this quote in the book where I say that patriarchy doesn't allow us to naturally mature out of our childhood dependency. It leverages that dependency instead in order to promote conformity. As mammals, we are particularly dependent when we're born human beings, whereas another mammal, like a cat or a horse or something, might be born on their feet, literally, straight away, almost. And they can become quite self-reliant quite quickly. Whereas we are not only dependent for at least the first 3 years of our lives, but our brains continue to develop, and kind of our neurological wiring is established in relationship to our caregivers. So that's another way in which this conditioning takes place. And the fact that that dependency is leveraged to promote conformity, rather than us being able to naturally, physiologically grow out of this period of dependency. I know some Indigenous cultures have rites of passage where Like in Aboriginal Australia, there's this term walkabout. From what I understand, it's like you get to a certain age, maybe adolescence, and you take off by yourself. And I know that this is, I think that this is a reasonably common rite of passage in different cultures into adulthood, where you experience a period of isolation and you confront your aloneness in the world. And you mature from that. Whereas in patriarchal culture, you're really not allowed to become an adult because it's your dependency that keeps you attached to society and also enables you to continue swallowing lies, because if you don't, you'll be left alone, and none of us want to do that because we're still immature in that way. Mm-hmm. So grappling with aloneness and that aloneness. We might be social beings, but we're born alone and we die alone. No one holds our hand when we go to the other side. So there's an element of aloneness that is part and parcel of our lives. And I think that we learn to not only repress that, but be absolutely terrified of it. And I believe that that is a big part of our social and political dysfunction at the moment, is that because we cannot stand alone, we would rather accept the most absurd of lies, if that's what the group demands, than to be cast out. And so I think that it's not even necessarily to do at this point with political signaling and all of that kind of stuff. This is the human condition. This is where 5,000 years of patriarchy and rape and pornography and trauma and violence has led us to the position that this is the reality. This is what we're doing.
And it is so far from the reality of who we are and of, our whole nature. So far. It's that old phrase, you shall have no God before me. And there is only male dominance and patriarchy, and that's all that exists. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. There's a segment in your book where you talk about the Great Mother. And I think that the quote is something about, it's she who gives us all to each other as food. Yeah, that one just completely knocked me over.
Wow, yeah.
I mean, that complete cycle of being, of giving and receiving in such a profound way is the cycle of life. Yeah. This thing that we're caught in is, I believe that there's a segment where you talk about external power and internal power. And that spoke to me profoundly as well. That internal power feels like the life force, the Eros, and the external power is patriarchal control. It's a death cult. There's an end to this. There's no cycle to this, but we're taught that that's all there is. And that's all that there's ever been. And you can't live with that, especially as a woman. I mean, I never could find my place in any of those stories. So I thank you for those gifts in the book. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your understanding of Eros.
Yeah, I mean, it all connects together, I guess. And what you just said about she who gives us all to each other as food. That's a quote from Monica Sho, the author of The Great Cosmic Mother, along with Barbara Moore. That quote comes from that book. And in that book, they also talk about this theme of death and aloneness, and she has this beautiful passage where she talks about, I guess it's Mother Earth or the goddess, and who we really are. And she talks about how we all live inside the body of God, and there's nowhere to go outside. You can't get outside. We're all part of this tapestry of life, in other words. And I think that is actually what confrontation with aloneness does teach us. And it did teach me, because I have this later on in the book where I talk about my experience of basically being continuously spat out by various political groups and movements, including ultimately, and I don't think I'm alone in having this experience, feminism. That's a big statement and generalization, but I guess all I experienced is that we're not a different species. Women are not a different species, and we're subject to the same kinds of conditioning as, we all live in this crazy society. So anytime you get into a group or get attached to group involvement, you're likely to come up against the same kinds of problems of people distancing themselves from certain other people. And, all those dynamics exist in all groups. And when I discovered that they exist in feminism too, which is natural, I was really devastated and not quite prepared for that, because I think perhaps I'd held some kind of fantasy vision about sisterhood that was then kind of smashed, which in hindsight was reasonably healthy. But the thing that it did for me, it kind of meant that I had lost touch with what I can perceive to be my last possible hopes of having any real connection to humanity at large. That sounds very dramatic, but it was like, if feminists who fully understand the political lens that I hold, which is the reason why I've been denied not only participation in groups of any other kind, but also help from the wider culture. So when I've been, for instance, harassed online or censored by media outlets, and I've approached organizations, or, I got banned from a community fair because I believe in biology, all these different experiences that I've had, that I've tried to go to various organizations, Human Rights Commission, or we have an organization here called NetSafe, which is about online safety. I've been going looking for help, and they all basically claim that what I say happened didn't happen. So it's, you constantly get this message back from the outside world that you don't exist, your life's not real, you're not important, you're irrelevant. And I kind of thought, well, if I get that as well from organized feminism, how on earth? It felt like a kind of death. I felt like, if the world outside doesn't recognize me, how do I know I'm even real? Like, it was like being like a ghost. I really took that quite hard, and I had like a month or two of just feeling really weirdly out of my body, until the cognitive dissonance of sort of feeling ghost-like but actually really being alive became too much. I kind of just became profoundly aware of the fact that my legs were still moving, my heart was still beating, and I was breathing and digesting food, and all these natural processes are going on, while at the same time I'm feeling like I'm erased and I don't exist. And so I started realizing that those two things cannot both be true. I'm either alive or I'm not. And I had to choose which to act according to. Am I going to act according to the signals I get from my heart beating and my breath coming in and out of my lungs and, my legs moving around? Or am I going to act according to the society telling me that I don't exist and I'm not real? And I chose the former, obviously. And so in my experience, that experience of aloneness is what brought me in touch with the fact that you cannot be cancelled, you cannot be extracted from the tapestry of life, and that's where you ultimately belong. And that is also what Eros is, and that is where authentic power comes from. And that's what Monica Shaw is talking about when she says, we all live in the body of God. There's nowhere else to go but here. You know what I mean? And so, and I think that's also what a lot of spiritual teachers encourage you to grapple with aloneness for, is that aloneness is what puts you in touch with your ultimate existence as a natural phenomenon, part of the matrix of existence and of life, and no more than that either, really, not all these ego identity things. And so when I talk about Eros in the book, it's that existence as part of the movement of life, which also I draw on writers like Osho, controversially I know, and Audre Lorde, who talk about how Eros is like this intricate connection between our living energies, our natural sensitivity, our creative expression, and also our sexuality. So they can't be taken apart from each other. That also explains why sex repression is so central to oppression, because it's Eros. It's the severing of our connection to our authentic existence, our authentic power. And anyway.
And when you talk about the violation of rape,
yeah,
you talk about rape a lot and about being in a rape culture. And I can't think of anything more devastating than rape as a way of shutting you down to your existence, to your eros, to your sensuality, to your being alive.
Yeah.
It's one hellaciously effective tool of patriarchy to destroy you, body and soul. And I'm really glad that you center on that in the book. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I feel like it is, again, one of the things that patriarchy does or has done is created this private sphere whereby, we used to live more communally, raise children more communally, and we didn't really have, I think, in our human origins, we don't really have this distinction between what is private and what is public in the way that we do in this culture, in a patriarchal culture. And in a culture like that, anything to do with sexuality is not necessarily considered to have real political importance or public importance. And so I think even with the Me Too movement having emerged in the last, I think it was about 2016 that it came up, so maybe 7 years, it's still, I don't think, treated in the same way as even institutionalized racism or climate change, where rape is, it's still about women's testimony, which is ultimately private. It's not the implications of living in a rape culture, what that truly means for us socially, what that truly means for us politically, what that means for the rest of the political landscape and how it's shaped. Those implications aren't fully investigated because it's matters of sexuality, including rape, are seen ultimately still as being something that happens in private life and isn't really a public issue. I think we still live with that kind of disconnect. But ultimately, the rape epidemic is the single most effective way to sustain any kind of power system and to sustain oppression. Attacking people at the level of sexuality is the best way to keep them submissive and subordinate and afraid. So
and disconnected and
dissociated.
In the fog. Dissociated, perpetually in a fog, perpetually confused.
Yeah.
Perpetually afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah. What part, this is kind of jumping from one area of Eros and creativity and connection to another one, but you also have a lot of experience in researching art and the importance of art, and you're a brilliant artist yourself. Would you speak a little bit about the place that art has in the unfolding of human beings and the place that it's had in your life?
Yeah, well, I did study art history, so that's been in my life. It's been in my life for always. But yeah, I think it relates to this theme of Eros and creative expression, even the things that you were kind of pointing at before around truth. We are all limited beings who only see the universe from a particular vantage point. So I think the way that we express truth always is creative. The way that we express what the world is to us is a creative act. And it arises, that is, also part and parcel of, what is Eros, what is authentic power. In the book, I have this, I mentioned before, this concept of responsibility. So gradually learning that not to constantly react, for instance, to the political landscape or the news cycle, but learning to respond instead of to react, and learning that this capacity to respond is ultimately your contribution, your power in the world, and that is, responsibility, that's creativity, they're synonymous. So the way that you creatively express like what it is to be alive today is our contribution. And I think that would be ultimately, that's been the basis of, the most inspiring political movements that have arisen. I think any political movement that is not creative fundamentally is either a military-based movement, or it is one that's trapped in this habit that I critique in my book of negotiation with authority figures, which I think is ultimately doomed. But yeah, and again, this quote I mentioned before from Monica Shaw about we're all part of, we all live in the body of God. And I guess another way of thinking about that is, without wanting to sound corny, God has many, many hands as she goes about her work and play of creating and recreating the universe each day. And two of those hands are yours, That's what authentic power is, reclaiming those and not buying into the idea that these institutional systems of power and protocol are even in any sense objectively real. They are a game. And I think reclaiming that authentic power that we have is really important. and perhaps more tangible level as well. I talk in the book about how after I started protesting on campus at the education faculty, that was in 2011. By the end of that year, I spoke at a conference, and someone came up to me, a drama school director came up to me and recommended me a book which was about some of New Zealand's education history. It was a social history documentary, which you mentioned in the bio that you read out at the beginning.
Yes.
About our early education reforms under the first Labour government. And what happened with that was that some of those war period socialist, democratic socialist thinkers like John Dewey were asking themselves what the place of education was within a democracy. If we want to have a democratic society, what would education have to look like? And many of them concluded that education would necessarily have to be arts-based. In order to feed into and sustain a democratic society, it would necessarily have to be arts-based, because that is the nature of the individual, that as we express what the world is to us, that is a creative expression, and refining our ability to do that, our ability to interpret from others and then discuss, is an artistic endeavor. And so when I ended up working on that documentary called The Heart of the Matter, which was about, it's stunning, it's really beautiful because it has, so there's so much historic footage in it, and you see how the education department started to set up these areas within New Zealand with where the schools were earmarked as experimental schools, so they weren't subject to the same procedures that normal schools were, that were in accordance with the old way. They were trying to establish this as a national policy, so they had to have some experimental schools to begin with. And what happened in those schools was that magical. They were, they trained teachers in accordance with these ideas. A lot of famous artists in New Zealand of a certain generation came out of the teacher training that was delivered at this time, when the marriage of arts education and democracy, the link between them was so valued and understood. And then when they began to run schools this way and create these conditions for children's creativity to flourish, it just makes me, I worked on this documentary, so I've seen the footage time and time again, and I still cry when I watch it because I find it so affecting, seeing these kids like going to do a day of exploring the rock pools, and then in order to learn about what they saw, they would draw pictures and then talk about the little organisms and stuff they saw and then refine their picture. You know what I mean? It was all fundamentally creative.
Beautiful.
Theatre, to kind of learn to access the voice, which of course in a society like ours, in a capitalist patriarchal society, you don't need to have access to that. Of course they're not going to give us a beautiful comprehensive arts education if they don't want us to have access to a full and confident voice. So no wonder that was all rolled back by around the 70s. But yeah, I think that documentary is very close to my heart still, because of not just the importance it places on art abstractly, but the footage and the evidence of real visceral records that it shows of classrooms where this idea was carried out. Yeah, beautiful artwork by these children.
That just, I haven't seen it yet. The blossoming, the potential that's inside of us to be so connected and so alive is what's touching me right now as you talk about this. And then the tragedy of what happened when they shut that program down, that they rolled it back, right? They took it away.
Yeah.
And it's no longer there.
Yeah.
So it's essential to being alive. In the title of your book, you talk about coming alive, that the ultimate place to arrive at is to come alive again, to emerge from the fog and to come alive. What does that mean for you after all of this searching and exploring and all of these brilliant and wise voices that have come into your life and everything that you've gone through to come this far? What does coming alive mean?
That's a really good question. I think since we were just talking about art and creativity, and that's precious on my mind, it kind of made me think as well about the connection between, again, creativity, Eros, sexuality. And I feel like it's no wonder that our early lives aren't premised on this valuing of arts and creative expression, I think that it's not only the porn culture we live in, but I think it's that contributes to the fact that we're all so sexually disconnected and confused, and creative expression is also something that prepares us to engage in intimate relationships. And I think that one thing that the creative expression and art and sexuality have in common is sensitivity. And I think that reclaiming our sensitivity is a big part of what it means to come alive. I also talk in the book about this, I call it a shift from external power and being beholden to external power structures and sort of enamored of, or artificially enamored of, like status, gaining status. I talk about a shift from that external power, being beholden to external power, to engaging or activating authentic power. And it, again, easily sounds like a very abstract or romanticized or sentimental notion, but I use very many examples of women who've made this shift in their lives, or talk about having these moments where, in one case, they talk about this woman, Sultram Alioni, who's also a Buddhist teacher. She talks about her experience of giving birth at home, and she had several people in the room. I think she was lying on her back, being told to push, like all that conventional practice. And then she just had this moment where she clicked. She told everyone to go away, give her distance, and she ended up like on all fours, and she just roared. And you know what I mean? Like she found within herself that commitment. I need to get this baby out, rather than, oh, that this person's telling me to do this, and that, oh, how, but you know, trying to reconcile these various different instructions that you've been given, or ideas about what's right and wrong. And there's another example I use of Chanel Miller, who wrote a book called Know My Name, which came out several years after her famous victim statement after the Brock Turner rape trial. And she has this moment where she's in court just being gaslit like you wouldn't believe, or maybe you would if you're a feminist and you're familiar with these processes, just interrupted and trivialized and gaslit and everything. And suddenly she just wails into this microphone. And it's like, those moments to me are a shift from trying to follow the rules, trying to obey, trying to be good, trying to be right, to just life taking over, and us, you know, taking it. Well, Chanel Miller said, stepping onto your own side. That was what she called that moment.
That reminds me of the moment you talked about, where you had to make a choice between, am I dead, or do I trust my own heart?
Yeah, do I trust the society's messaging that's saying that I'm maybe not dead, maybe just unalive? I don't know what
Invisible.
Invisible. Yeah,
Something.
non-existent.
Yeah.
Yeah, or do I trust my beating heart? Yeah.
Trust my beating heart.
Yeah.
Trust my instinct. Trust whatever. Yeah.
But I think as well, for me, perhaps it is somewhat of a more accessible, realistic level. Like for me, I've got this impulse and instinct to read in response to my burning questions, to kind of surface and articulate my burning questions, and then read in response to those. And I've found that as I've done that, you know, I know sometimes in spiritual circles or among spiritual teachers, reading is kind of discredited as being the hungry intellect trying to accumulate knowledge, you know, and that's not where the answers lie. But for me, it's been a process of shedding social messages, shedding confusion and fog and misconceptions that I had grown up with. And you read these books and it starts falling off me. So reading has been for me a process of, you know, you learn from it, but just as much it's been the way that I've gotten rid of baggage that I don't need to carry, and answered questions that have been sitting in there nagging. And then suddenly, like, you know, you read certain things and it just, light starts coming in. Yeah,
I've had that experience too. And your bibliographies on both of your works, I mean, your first with the Brief Complete Herstory series, and this one as well, are my reading list now. I mean, it's just like, there's so much wisdom there and so much wealth there. And that's another gift that you've given. I really am so grateful to you for sharing this journey. Do you have a place that you're going next? Where are you going now? What's the next thing that you're going to do? You mentioned it briefly, and I'm very intrigued that you're writing another book.
I am working on a manuscript, but
Working on the manuscript?
who knows what will happen with it. It's just I'm allowing it to brew and grow, and it's, like you do when you're gardening. Like, I don't know how fruitful it will, but it is a really nice project to have going on in the background. But meanwhile, I think having just published this book, I often get people ask me if I'm experiencing some major sense of achievement or something like that. And I'm like, oh, actually, for me, the biggest reward has been that in releasing something that feels like it's been accumulating and growing within me for such a long time, I feel like a new person. Like, I feel like I can discover what my life is all about now that it's not the primary thing. So I'm really enjoying discovering that and addressing parts of my life that have been neglected for quite a while. And also challenging myself to walk the talk a little more and really put some of these ideas that, into action and keep deepening them. So, that's...
Have you ever thought about, like, in DGR in the past, there have been discussion groups around books. Have you ever thought about participating in a discussion group with a bunch of your audience, your readers now? Or I'm just wondering, or if you thought about a tour, or is it just fun to let go, like you said, and explore other parts of your life?
Yeah, I'm really enjoying that. But also I've found that in terms of the geography, like the place where I'm at, there doesn't seem to be a huge interest in my work in New Zealand. I don't hustle. I don't try to make people interested when I don't find that they are. And I feel that most of the interest in my work is overseas in places that are hard to get to nowadays. So, and I'm a little bit resistant to screen culture. So I would certainly do that, but I don't think I would. Yeah, it's difficult. So I've kind of been learning to just, that whole thing about responding rather than reacting has kind of taught me that. And once you've made your response, it's like having a baby and watching it grow. It's its own person now, and I don't have to necessarily even know what people are saying or thinking or. Yeah, but
Wow.
I mean, it would also be nice to have more contact with other writers and other readers, but maybe that will come in time. But at the moment, in New Zealand, I'm not super connected to those types of communities. So that's just, that's how it is over here for me.
Yeah, I want to thank you for acknowledging the little part that I played in it's very humbling, and I'm mystified by it. And thank you. You give so much respect in doing that, and I appreciate it so much. And I do hope that at some point it won't be screen time anymore. It would be absolutely wonderful to be in an audience at some place like Philia, watching you present your book or talk about your concepts. It is very strange how sometimes home doesn't see you, but you're seen well and respectfully in other places in the world. So who knows what'll happen next. It's really been wonderful talking to you. And I hope that when you're ready and another part of your life has happened and this manuscript has gone someplace or something else occurs, that you'll reach out again and we'll welcome you back onto the Green Flame.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
This is Max Wilbert, one of the hosts of the Green Flame podcast. I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways that you can support the Green Flame. First, you can subscribe to our platform using the podcasting system of your choice. We're listed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pocket Cast, and all the rest. We're even on YouTube. Leaving us a positive review or rating on these platforms helps us reach a larger audience. You can also share these shows with your friends. If you're interested in donating to support the production of the Green Flame, please visit deepgreenresistance.org. And finally, the goal of this show is to activate people. So if you really want to support this show, start organizing in your own community. Thank you again for listening.